What would you do if a single act of kindness transformed your quiet life into a whirlwind of mystery and hope? Picture this. Rob Thompson, a 60-year-old former soldier, leans against the scratched counter of Thompson's Corner Store, a humble grocery shop that has anchored his family in Willow Creek for over 30 years. The lines etched into his weathered face tell tales of laughter and hardship, his broad shoulders now slightly stooped from decades of lifting crates and stocking shelves. The store itself is modest, 7 narrow aisles, a small produce corner, and a butcher's counter where Rob still slices meats by hand, the rhythmic thud of his knife a comforting rhythm in the quiet. To the townsfolk of Willow Creek, this place is more than a market. It's a heartbeat where neighbors swap stories, pin notices for lost pets on a corkboard, and where Rob has watched generations grow into parents themselves. Few know of his 15 years in the 82nd Airborne, a past he keeps private, its echoes preserved in a faded photo and a shadow box of medals tucked away in his office. But times have grown tough. 8 months ago, a gleaming megamart opened on the town's edge, its low prices and vast selection slowly draining Rob's livelihood. For the first time in 32 years, he's behind on loan payments, the weight of that failure pressing against his chest. Over breakfast that morning, his wife of 38 years, Margaret, gazed at him with worry creasing her still lovely face. The aroma of her beef stew lingered, but her words cut through it like a chill wind. "The gas bill came, Rob, and the bank payments due next week," she said, her voice tight with fear. Their daughter, Emily, a Navy officer on her second deployment, remains unaware of their struggles, her bright smile in their rare video calls a shield against the truth they've withheld. Now, put yourself in Rob's shoes as the clock nears 8:55 p.m., the bell above the door chimes, and a struggling family steps inside. Will you risk everything to help them, or guard what little you have left? Let your heart decide, and join us at Daily Narrated Stories for more tales that touch the soul. Subscribe now, and hit that like button to stay with us. The family moved through the aisles with a silent efficiency that tugged at Rob's heart. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a soft, uneven glow across the worn linoleum floor as Daniel Carter led his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children, a boy with a mop of brown hair and a girl with bouncing pigtails, through the narrow rows. Rob watched from behind the counter, his hands absently wiping a rag over a spot he'd cleaned a dozen times, the rough texture grounding him as his gaze followed their hesitant steps. Daniel's shoulders tensed as he picked up a can of beans, only to set it back down after a whispered exchange with Sarah, her voice a low murmur barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. The children trailed close, their sneakers scuffing softly against the floor, their small hands empty of the toys or snacks most kids their age would beg for. There was a quiet dignity in their restraint, a maturity born of a life where wants bowed to necessity, and it stirred a deep ache in Rob's chest, a memory of soldiers he'd known, their eyes hollowed by battles fought far from home. At the checkout, their basket held the barest essentials, a pound of discounted ground beef, its packaging crinkled and faded, a loaf of day-old bread marked down to $1, its crust slightly stale, and a bag of bruised apples Rob had set aside for clearance, their skins mottled with brown spots. Daniel placed each item on the counter with deliberate care, as if the act were a ritual of control in a life unraveling at the seams. Sarah stood beside him, her expression a blend of gratitude and exhaustion, her hands resting gently on her children's shoulders, a silent anchor in their uncertainty. The boy glanced at his sister, then at the tray of fresh turkey sandwiches behind Rob, his lips parting slightly before he pressed them shut, a flicker of longing quickly suppressed. The girl's eyes followed, her pigtails swaying as she tilted her head, but she too remained silent, her small frame radiating a quiet resilience that pierced Rob's soul. "New to Willow Creek?" Rob asked, his voice warm as he began scanning their items, the beep of the scanner slicing through the stillness, each sound a reminder of the mounting total. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, his tone crisp with military precision, an echo of the discipline that had once defined him. "We moved here 10 days ago after my medical discharge." Rob nodded, his eyes catching the subtle wince as Daniel shifted his weight, favoring his left leg, a lingering injury, perhaps, one that haunted him like a ghost from a past life. Rob had seen that shuffle in his own mirror years ago, after a parachute jump gone wrong left his knee aching on rainy days, a constant companion to his quiet struggles. As the total climbed to $46.12, Daniel's face fell, a shadow passing over his features. His hand froze mid-reach for his worn wallet, fingers hovering as if willing more bills to materialize from the frayed leather. Rob recognized that look, the gut-wrenching collision of hope and despair, a silent scream trapped behind a soldier's stoic mask. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Sarah, who bit her lip and looked down, her shoulders slumping under an invisible burden. The children stood statue still, their earlier longing for the sandwiches replaced by a somber understanding, their small faces reflecting a world where joy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Rob's mind flashed to a statistic from a veterans newsletter. Over 37% of American veterans face financial hardship after discharge, their sacrifices met with a civilian war of overdue bills and empty pantries. The weight of that truth settled over him, a heavy cloak he couldn't shake. In that moment, Rob's heart surged ahead of his mind, a decision born of instinct rather than reason. "You know," he said, his voice steady as he punched keys on the register, "today's the first day of our military family gratitude discount." He met Daniel's eyes, a silent current of understanding passing between them. Two men who'd faced the same shadows, fought the same battles, even if on different fronts. Daniel blinked, confusion knitting his brow, his voice hesitant. "Military discount? But I'm not in uniform. How did you?" Rob's lips curved into a knowing smile, the lines around his eyes deepening like the pages of a well-worn book. "The way you carry yourself, the way you scanned the room when you walked in. Once you've served, you see it in others." He paused, his fingers deftly adding items to their bags. 2 turkey sandwiches for the kids, their wrappers crinkling softly, a jug of milk, cold against his palms, and a handful of oranges he'd planned to mark down tomorrow, their citrus scent wafting up as he worked. The little girl's eyes widened, her small hand reaching out instinctively before she caught herself and pulled back, a flicker of hope quickly restrained. "I was with the 82nd Airborne years ago," Rob shared, his hands moving with the practiced ease of decades, the memory of C-130 engines roaring and parachutes snapping open flooding back, the camaraderie of his unit a bittersweet echo. Daniel straightened, a spark of recognition igniting in his tired eyes. "Special Forces, 3 tours, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Syria," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride, though the weight of those years pressed down on him, visible in the slump of his shoulders. The children watched, wide-eyed, as Rob slipped the extra items into their bags. The boy's fingers twitched, imagining the taste of the sandwich, while the girl's gaze followed an orange rolling into the bag, her lips parting in a silent gasp of wonder that tugged at Rob's heartstrings. "Sir, we can't accept this," Daniel said, his voice tight with pride, the kind that had carried him through missions where survival was never certain. "We'll pay for what we picked." Rob leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear, the scent of the store's wooden shelves mingling with the tension in the air. "I know what it's like, son, trying to keep your family fed when the world's against you. The transition back, it's never what they promise, is it?" The words stirred memories of Rob's own return, the hollow assurances of support dissolving into red tape, the nights he'd lain awake wondering how to stretch a dollar. He tapped the register, dropping the total to $30.25, a number he knew Daniel could manage. Sarah touched Daniel's arm, her eyes pleading silently, a wordless bond honed by years of standing together through deployments and recoveries. The children's hopeful faces, bright with the promise of a meal, spoke louder than any argument, their small smiles a beacon in the dim light. After a tense moment, Daniel's shoulders relaxed, and he gave a sharp, military nod, the gesture carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken thanks. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with gratitude, a bridge between 2 strangers bound by service. As the family gathered their bags, Rob noticed the children's faces light up at the sight of the sandwiches. The girl clutched hers to her chest like a treasure, her brother mirroring her joy with a grin that broke through his earlier restraint. Rob watched them head to their beat-up SUV, its paint chipped and one taillight flickering like a dying star, the cold night air biting at his skin as he lingered by the door. He waited until they were loading their groceries before pulling a crisp $100 bill from his wallet, a bill he'd set aside for the electric company, but one he knew they needed more. Scribbling a note on a scrap of receipt paper, from one soldier to another, no repayment needed. He slipped it into a side pocket of their bag while helping with the last items, the paper crinkling under his fingers. Daniel tried to thank him again, his voice thick with emotion, but Rob waved it off with a gentle smile. "Welcome to Willow Creek. Come back anytime." The bell chimed softly as they left, leaving the store in a heavy silence that pressed against Rob's ears. He locked up, his movements slow, the weight of the day settling into his bones like a winter chill. He climbed the creaky stairs to the apartment above the store, where he and Margaret had lived for 27 years, the scent of her beef stew filling the air with a warmth that clashed with the cold knot in his stomach. Margaret sat at their worn kitchen table, the ledger open before her, her reading glasses perched on her nose, the soft scratch of her pen against paper the only sound. Her face, still beautiful to Rob despite the lines etched by years of worry, was shadowed with concern. "You gave away more today, didn't you?" she asked, her voice not accusatory but resigned, her finger tracing a line of red ink that seemed to bleed across the page like a wound. "Rob, we can't keep doing this. We're barely afloat." Rob sighed, sinking into a chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight, a familiar groan that mirrored his exhaustion. "They were veterans, Margaret. A family with young kids," he said, his voice soft, pleading for her to see the duty that had driven him, the call of brotherhood that lingered even after he'd hung up his uniform. Margaret flipped the pages, revealing columns of debt that grew with every turn, the numbers a stark testament to their struggle. "And you're a veteran with bills," she countered, her tone sharpening with a mother's protectiveness, though her eyes softened with love. "The bank called. They're 2 payments behind on the loan. If we don't pay by next Thursday, they'll start foreclosure. We could lose everything." Her voice cracked on the last word, a fracture in the strength she'd held onto for so long, her hands trembling as she gripped the table's edge. Rob's stomach churned, the stew in his bowl suddenly unappetizing, its rich aroma turning sour in his nose. "I'll figure it out," he said, though his voice wavered with doubt, the promise feeling hollow in the face of their reality. "Maybe a personal loan?" Margaret shook her head, her fingers trembling as she closed the ledger with a heavy thud that echoed in the small room. "With what collateral?" "Everything's tied to the store," she said, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose, a gesture to ward off the headache she felt building behind her eyes. "I love your heart, Rob. It's why I fell for you all those years ago at that veteran support group. But you've got to take care of us first." The words hung between them, a painful truth wrapped in the love they'd built over decades, the clink of forks against plates the only sound as they ate in silence, each bite a reminder of the uncertainty looming over them. Later, unable to sleep, Rob returned to the darkened store. The moonlight filtered through the front windows, casting a silver glow over the aisles he'd walked 1,000 times, the shadows stretching long and eerie across the floor. He sat on a stool behind the counter, his hands tracing the familiar grooves in the wood where he'd stood for nearly 3 decades serving his community, the faint scent of the day's produce and lingering coffee a bittersweet reminder of better days. His eyes fell on a framed photo of Emily in her Navy uniform, her posture proud, her smile a beacon of hope in a world that often felt too heavy. He picked it up, running his thumb over the glass, the cool surface grounding him as his mind spiraled with doubt. "What would you do, sweetheart?" he whispered to the empty store, his voice a fragile thread in the stillness. "If your family was struggling, would someone help you?" The question lingered, heavy in the air, as Rob wrestled with whether his kindness had been noble or a reckless gamble that might cost him everything. Upstairs, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, the ledger still open, though she hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour. The stew had gone cold, the pot untouched since Rob had gone downstairs, its once warm scent now a faint memory in the chilly room. She stared at the columns of numbers, each red figure a silent accusation, a reminder of the sacrifices they'd made to keep the store alive. Her mind drifted to the early days, when they'd taken over Thompson's corner from Rob's father, the laughter as they'd stocked shelves together, the pride of their first profitable year, the joy of raising Emily in the apartment above, her giggles echoing through the walls. But those memories felt distant now, overshadowed by the relentless pressure of the megamart, the loan payments, the constant fear of losing the life they'd built. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, her hands balling into fists on the table. She loved Rob's heart, his unshakable need to help others, a trait that had drawn her to him when they'd met 40 years ago at a veterans support group. She'd been a nurse then, tending to soldiers with wounds both visible and hidden, and Rob had been a young man fresh from the army, his eyes haunted, but his smile wide open. He'd brought her coffee during a late shift, his shy grin melting her defenses, and she'd known he was the kind of man who'd give his last dollar to a stranger. But now, that same generosity felt like a double-edged sword. She understood why he'd helped the Carters. She'd seen the desperation in their eyes, the same look she'd seen in countless veterans over the years, but the reality of their situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. What if they lost the store? What if they lost their home? What if Emily returned to find her parents with nothing but memories? "Please, let this work out," she whispered to the night, her breath fogging the window, a prayer to a universe that had often seemed indifferent to their struggles. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Rob unlocked Thompson's corner store for another day. He moved through his opening routine with a mechanical precision, checking the stock, arranging the apples in neat rows, their waxy skins cool under his fingers, brewing the free coffee that filled the air with a rich, comforting aroma. But his mind churned with Margaret's words, the bank's deadline a ticking bomb just 7 days away, its rhythm a constant pulse against his temples. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a dull ache no amount of coffee could soothe. Mrs. Harper, a retired librarian and one of his most loyal customers, noticed his distraction as she picked out her usual loaf of rye bread, its crust crackling softly in her hands. "You all right, Rob? You seem far away today," she said, her voice gentle with concern, her gray eyes searching his face. Rob forced a smile, the effort feeling like lifting a boulder, his lips trembling slightly. "Just thinking about orders," he lied, restocking the bread aisle with a loaf that slipped from his hands, nearly falling to the floor before he caught it, the thud against his palm a jolt of reality. By mid-morning, the store hummed with its usual rhythm. An elderly couple picked through the potatoes, their voices a soft murmur as they debated between russet and red, the earthy scent of the tubers filling the air. A young father browsed with his infant, the baby cooing softly in a carrier strapped to his chest, its tiny hands reaching for a box of cereal. Rob was calculating whether selling Margaret's grandmother's silver teapot, its intricate engravings a memory of family gatherings long past, might buy them a few more weeks when a low rumble broke his thoughts. At first, he thought it was a storm, the kind that rolled in unexpectedly and drenched the town in minutes, the memory of rain against the roof a familiar comfort. But the sky outside was a brilliant blue, not a cloud in sight, the sunlight glinting off the store's windows. The sound grew louder, a deep growl of engines, multiple vehicles, closing in with a purpose that sent a shiver down Rob's spine, the hairs on his neck standing on end. "What on earth?" Mr. Jenkins, another regular, looked up from his list, his glasses slipping down his nose as he peered toward the windows, his brow furrowed with confusion. Rob stepped to the front windows, his heart quickening, the glass cool against his palm as he pressed closer to see. Outside, customers on the sidewalk froze, their bags dangling forgotten at their sides, their attention drawn down Elm Street, the morning breeze carrying the faint scent of exhaust. The rumble became a roar, shaking the glass jars on the shelves, a few toppling with a clatter that made Rob flinch, the sound echoing in the quiet store like a warning. Then they appeared, a convoy of military vehicles, led by a hulking armored Humvee, its dark green paint gleaming in the morning sun, its bulk a stark contrast to the quaint storefront. Behind it rolled 3 transport trucks and several jeeps, their tires kicking up dust as they turned onto the street, their military markings bold against the small-town backdrop of Willow Creek. "Is this a parade?" someone murmured, their voice tinged with confusion, the hope in their tone quickly fading. But there was no festivity in their movements. The vehicles stopped with precision, surrounding Thompson's corner store, the Humvee blocking the entrance like a sentinel, its shadow falling across the door. Within moments, uniformed soldiers poured out, at least 25, in full gear, their boots hitting the pavement with a synchronized thud that reverberated through the quiet morning, the sound a drumbeat of tension. They established a perimeter with practiced efficiency, their movements a dance of discipline and purpose, their rifles slung across their chests, the metal glinting ominously in the sunlight. Rob's mind raced, his breath catching in his throat, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. A national emergency he'd missed? A drill he hadn't heard about? Or worse, news about Emily? Dread coiled in his gut, a slithering fear that wrapped around his heart as he imagined the worst. A knock on the door, a folded flag, a life cut short in a land far away. Inside, customers pressed toward the windows, whispering anxiously, their faces pale with confusion, the air thick with unease. Outside, townsfolk gathered across the street, phones raised to capture the scene, their voices a low hum of speculation that carried through the glass, the click of shutters a staccato rhythm against the silence. A senior officer stepped from the Humvee, his uniform heavy with insignia that spoke of high rank, his face a mask of authority as he surveyed the storefront, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He spoke into a radio, his words clipped and inaudible, the static crackling faintly in the distance, then strode toward the entrance with a purposeful gait that made Rob's stomach drop, his pulse pounding in his ears. The bell chimed, a jarring note in the tense air. As the officer entered, his polished boots clicking against the linoleum, the sound a stark intrusion into the familiar quiet. His gaze swept the store, taking in the scattered customers, the half-stocked shelves, the faint scent of coffee still lingering, before landing on Rob with the precision of a hawk spotting its prey. "Robert Thompson?" His voice was a command, deep and unyielding, the kind that brooked no argument, its resonance filling the space. Rob swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper, his throat tight with fear. "That's me, sir," he managed, his voice a fragile whisper, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "We need you to step outside, now," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation, the urgency in his words a knife edge of tension. The store fell deathly silent, the air thick with a palpable dread, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. Mrs. Harper clutched her basket to her chest, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with fear, the wicker creaking under her grip. The young father pulled his baby close, whispering comforts as the infant began to fuss, its soft cries a sharp contrast to the gravity of the moment. The back door flew open with a bang, the wood slamming against the wall, and Margaret rushed in from their upstairs apartment, her face pale as a ghost, her hair still mussed from a restless night, strands clinging to her damp cheeks. "Rob, what's happening? Why are there military trucks everywhere?" Her voice trembled, her hands wringing the hem of her sweater, the fabric twisting under her nervous fingers as she stopped short at the sight of the officer standing in their store, his presence a stark contrast to the familiar chaos of their daily life. Rob could see the fear in her eyes, a mirror to the terror coursing through his own veins, a cold shiver racing down his spine. He moved to her side, taking her trembling hand in his, the warmth of her skin a small anchor in the storm of uncertainty, her pulse racing against his palm. "It's okay," he whispered, though he felt anything but certain, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue, a desperate attempt to shield her from the unknown. Together, they followed the officer through the door and onto the sidewalk, the cold morning air biting at their faces, the scent of dew and exhaust mingling as they stepped into the surreal scene unfolding before them. Soldiers at attention, their uniforms crisp against the dawn light, vehicles lining the street, a growing crowd of neighbors watching in awe, their breaths visible in the chill. Mr. Davis from the florist stood with his arms crossed, the faint scent of roses clinging to his jacket. The Millers from the diner whispered to each other, their aprons still dusted with flour. Reverend Carter from Willow Creek Church clutched his Bible, its leather worn from years of use. All of them drawn by the spectacle, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern, the murmur of their voices a low tide against the silence. The officer turned to them, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp as they assessed Rob, the weight of his gaze a physical pressure. "Mr. Thompson, you assisted a family last night. The Carters? Margaret's grip tightened, her nails digging into Rob's palm, a silent plea for answers, her breath hitching with every second of uncertainty. So this was about his kindness. But why the military? Why the convoy? Why the armed soldiers surrounding their store like it was a war zone, their presence a shadow over the life he'd built? Yes, sir, Rob said, his voice steadier than he felt, though his heart pounded against his ribs like a drum, each beat a question he couldn't answer. They came in, I helped them. They're new here. The officer's gaze bore into him, searching for something Rob couldn't name, the intensity of it making his skin prickle. Tell me exactly what happened between you and Major Daniel Carter, he said, his voice low, almost a challenge, the word major hanging in the air like a puzzle piece waiting to fit. Rob's confusion must have shown, his brow furrowing as he replayed the previous night in his mind, the memory of Daniel's tired eyes and quiet strength a blur against the officer's words. The officer tilted his head, a flicker of something, amusement, crossing his stern face, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. You didn't know who he was, did you? He asked, his tone softer now, but still laced with an edge of curiosity, his eyes narrowing as if testing Rob's response. He was a veteran who needed help, Rob replied, his voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling in his gut, the truth of his intent a shield against the unknown. That's all I knew. The officer nodded, his lips twitching as if holding back a smile, the tension easing ever so slightly. Did he mention anything unusual during your conversation? He pressed, his voice deliberate, each word a step closer to a truth Rob couldn't yet grasp. Anything that might have stood out to you? Rob shook his head, his mind racing back to Daniel's limp, his military bearing, the way he'd hesitated before accepting the help, the faint tremor in his hands as he counted his coins. No, sir, he said, his voice faltering, the memory a jumbled tapestry he couldn't unravel. He just seemed like a man trying to take care of his family. The officer's gaze held his for a long moment, the silence stretching taut as a wire, the crowd beyond the perimeter holding its breath, the click of a camera shutter breaking the stillness. And the note you left, the $100, the officer continued, his voice measured, each word a deliberate probe. Why did you do that? Rob swallowed, his throat tight, the memory of his own struggles a raw wound reopened. Because I've been where he is, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of his own battles, the nights he'd gone without to feed his family. I wanted to help. The officer's stern face softened into a smile, a jarring shift in the tense moment that sent a ripple of confusion through Rob, the warmth in the officer's eyes a stark contrast to the cold steel of his uniform. Sir, the man you helped was Major Daniel Carter, one of the most decorated officers in his unit, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street, the words a thunderclap in the stillness. But he'd never tell you that himself. Rob's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. I don't understand, he said, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd, the ground seeming to tilt beneath his feet. Why send a convoy over some groceries and $100? The officer's gaze held his, steady and unwavering, the intensity of it a lifeline in the storm. Major Carter commands Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 7th Navy, your daughter's unit, Mr. Thompson. The world tilted on its axis, the revelation a physical blow that left Rob reeling, his knees weakening as the words sank in. Emily? This is about Emily. His voice broke, a crack in the facade of calm he'd been clinging to, the fear he'd held at bay surging to the surface. Margaret's nails dug deeper into his arm, her breath hitching as she whispered, Is she okay? Has something happened? Her voice a fragile thread of hope. The officer's voice remained calm, professional, but there was a warmth in it now, a humanity that hadn't been there before, the steadiness of it a balm to their fear. 5 days ago, during a classified mission, their unit was ambushed, he said, his words measured, each one a blow to Rob's already fragile composure, the memory of Emily's last call flashing through his mind. A missile strike collapsed their position. Your daughter, Lieutenant Thompson, was trapped inside. Rob's knees buckled, his vision blurring as the words hit him like a physical force, the air rushing from his lungs in a gasp. Margaret clung to him, her hand flying to her mouth, a sob escaping as she buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking through his shirt. Major Carter went back into that collapsing structure, against orders, to pull her out. The officer continued, his voice steady but laced with respect, the weight of the heroism palpable in the air. He sustained severe injuries and was medevaced here for treatment. Rob's mind reeled, fragments of the previous night flashing through his mind. Daniel's limp, his tired eyes, the quiet strength that had seemed so familiar. A puzzle now coming together with devastating clarity. "You're saying the man I helped saved Emily's life?" Rob asked, his voice trembling, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like a tidal wave, his heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Yes, sir," the officer said, a genuine respect in his eyes that made Rob's throat tighten, the sincerity a lifeline in the chaos. From behind him, Daniel Carter emerged, now in dress uniform, his medals gleaming despite the noticeable limp that marked each step, the crisp lines of his attire a stark contrast to the weary man of the night before. "I didn't want to accept your help, Mr. Thompson," Daniel said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd, each word a testament to the pride that had carried him through his career, the weight of it etched into his features. "Pride, I guess. But when I found your note and the $100, I reported it to my commander. An extraordinary act of kindness from a fellow veteran. I had no idea you were Emily's father." Margaret was sobbing openly now, her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened, her body shaking with the force of her relief. "Is Emily okay?" she managed, her voice choked with emotion, her eyes pleading for reassurance, the hope in them a fragile flame. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, his tone softening as he met her gaze, the warmth in his eyes a mirror to her own. "Thanks to me. She has minor injuries and is back with her unit. I needed surgery, so I was sent home to recover." The crowd, silent until now, erupted into applause, the sound swelling like a wave as the story unfolded, a collective release of the tension that had gripped them all, the clapping a rhythm of celebration and awe. Daniel stepped forward, offering his hand to Rob, his eyes steady despite the emotion shimmering within them, the calluses on his palm a testament to his service. "Your daughter is an incredible sailor, sir. She speaks of this store with such pride. It's her anchor." Rob shook his hand, emotions choking his words, the weight of gratitude and awe rendering him speechless, his throat tight with unshed tears. But the story wasn't over. A senior officer, Colonel Harris, approached, his presence commanding as he extended a hand to Rob, the gold of his insignia catching the light. "Mr. Thompson, when word spread of your kindness, helping Major Carter's family while facing your own struggles, the sailors in your daughter's unit took action," he said, his voice warm but authoritative, the strength in it a promise of support. He gestured to the trucks, their doors now open, sailors unloading box after box with practiced efficiency, the thud of cardboard against the pavement a new rhythm in the morning. The entire battalion contributed. Rob watched, his breath catching as the sailors carried not weapons, but premium groceries, household goods, cases of high-end canned goods, their labels pristine. Fresh produce, the scent of apples and oranges wafting through the air, even small appliances, their boxes gleaming with promise. Items Rob could never have afforded to stock otherwise, a lifeline for a store teetering on the edge of collapse. Margaret wept openly beside him, her hands clasped over her heart, the tears on her cheeks catching the sunlight like diamonds, her sobs a mix of relief and joy. Another officer approached, a young woman in uniform, her face solemn as she handed Rob a large envelope, the paper crinkling under his trembling fingers. "Sir, the Navy Relief Fund heard about your situation," she said, her voice steady, a quiet strength in her words. "This is for you." Rob opened it, the envelope's flap catching on his thumb, revealing a check large enough to cover their loan in full, the numbers a blur through his tears, with a note that read, "To one of our own families." The weight of the gesture hit him like a wave, his eyes blurring as he looked at Margaret, her face a mirror of his own disbelief and gratitude, her hand reaching for his as they stood together in the midst of the miracle unfolding before them. The crowd parted, a ripple of gasps and murmurs spreading through the townsfolk as a familiar figure stepped forward, a young woman in uniform, her right arm in a sling, but her smile unmistakable, a beacon of light in the chaos of the morning, the sunlight glinting off her metals. "Emily," Margaret cried, her voice breaking as she broke into a run, her feet pounding against the pavement, the sound a heartbeat of hope. "Hey, Mom," Emily Thompson said, wrapping her good arm around her mother as Margaret crashed into her, sobs racking her frame, the warmth of their embrace a stark contrast to the cold fear of moments before. "They gave me emergency leave when they heard what happened," Emily explained, her voice soft but steady, her eyes shining with emotion as she looked at her father, the love in them a balm to his soul. Rob approached, tears streaming down his face, the salt stinging his skin, and embraced his daughter, the warmth of her presence a balm to the fear that had gripped him, the fabric of her uniform rough against his cheek. "You didn't tell us you were hurt," he said, his voice thick as he touched her sling, the bandage a stark reminder of her bravery. "It's just a sprained wrist, Dad. Thanks to Major Carter," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly, the gratitude in her eyes a mirror to her father's, the memory of that moment a shadow they'd carried together. "If he hadn't gone back," her voice trailed off, the unspoken outcome hanging heavy in the air, a chilling what if that lingered like a ghost. The townsfolk of Willow Creek, now understanding the full story, joined the sailors in unloading supplies, their hands working in tandem with the uniformed men and women, the laughter and chatter filling the air, the tension of the morning giving way to a shared sense of purpose and joy, the scent of fresh produce mingling with the salt of tears. A month later, Thompson's corner store was transformed, the loan paid, inventory expanded with goods that drew customers from miles around, business thriving with a vibrancy it hadn't known in years. Rob created a sailor's nook in the store, a small corner with a coffee pot bubbling with warmth, resources for veterans laid out on a wooden table, and a bulletin board where military families could connect, a testament to the ripple effect of his kindness, the soft hum of conversation, a new heartbeat in the space. Daniel Carter, now a regular at the store, sat with Rob in the sailor's nook, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the quiet exchange of stories, tales of their service, the dust of foreign lands, and Emily's latest missions, her voice a distant echo in their words. "She gets her heart from you," Daniel said, watching Rob hand out coffee to a young veteran couple, their faces weary but hopeful, the steam rising like a promise. Rob shook his head, the humility in his gesture a reflection of his soul. "I did what anyone would," he murmured, the words soft but firm. Daniel smiled, the warmth in his eyes a mirror to the bond they'd forged. "That's where you're wrong. Most wouldn't. That's what makes it special," he replied, the truth of it settling over them like a gentle rain. The bell above the door chimed with a frequency it hadn't known before, customers pouring in, drawn by the story that had spread beyond Willow Creek, the tale of the incident, a beacon for visitors from neighboring towns, their footsteps a testament to the power of kindness. A year later, during what the town now called the Thompson Mission, Rob stood outside his revitalized store, the paint fresh and the windows gleaming, alongside Daniel, Emily, home on leave, her sling replaced by a proud stance, and Margaret, her smile radiant with relief. The base commander awarded Rob the Civilian Service Medal, the medal cool against his palm, for founding Operation Thompson, a program supporting military families in transition, its roots deep in the community's soil. A journalist approached, her microphone glinting in the sunlight, and asked how he felt about it all. Rob paused, the weight of the moment settling into his bones, then said, "In life, what you give returns in ways you'd never expect. A few free groceries can change someone's world, and yours." His voice carried the wisdom of a man who'd seen both loss and redemption, the words a bridge to every listener. Reflect on this. When has a small act of kindness in your life led to an unexpected connection, a thread of hope in the fabric of your days? Share your story in the comments. We're building a community of compassion at Daily Narrated Stories, and your voice matters in this circle of care. The legacy of that day lives on, a testament to the power of empathy, the strength of human bonds, and the courage to give when the world feels dark. At Daily Narrated Stories, we bring you tales like these, stories of hope, resilience, and the human spirit that remind us of what truly endures. Don't miss your chance to be part of our journey. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and join our family of storytellers, because the next inspiring tale is just a click away, and this opportunity to connect won't wait forever.